Just need a slide clicker. So, hi everybody, my name is Justin Ritter, and I'm an independent consultant working out of Boston in the United States. And I'm here to talk to you about some stuff that apparently you guys already know about. OAuth and OpenID Connect. And really what we were asked to do for this panel is come up with what we were going to be seeing within really the scope of the next 3 years. So what Kai really did was ask us to predict the future. Thank you very much. And the thing is, the thing about the future is that, come on. So this is where that next slide is supposed to come in. Yeah, this one's not working. Yeah, well, so the thing is, we've got 45 slides to go through here, so it'll be a lot easier if I can actually click them. Sorry. This was working when I was standing in the back room. Maybe I should present from back there. Do we know what's going on yet? Okay, I guess I'm just going to keep talking in the background. If you could go to the next slide while we're trying to figure this out. The thing about this talk and the next 3 that you're going to be hearing is that we're here to lie to you. Because nobody can really predict the future, but we can give a pretty good guess and direction of where we think things might be going. And so that's really why we're here today. Next slide. For example, one of the things that I think that we can say. Yeah, you see, it's really hard to get a good cadence going when you can't. There we go. I strongly believe that distributed encrypted databases are going to happen. That's really going to be a thing. That's a nut that people have been wanting to crack for a really long time. But I honestly don't think that it's going to happen on the blockchain. I think the blockchain and Bitcoin are a really interesting step in that direction, but I don't think that's where we're going to end up. Next slide, please. And another thing that I think that we can say is that big PKI is really changing. It's dying a slow death, slightly slower than the slide progression. There we go. Because we've got a lot of smaller connected technologies that are actually, can we go back please? We've got a lot of smaller connected technologies, things that are designed for the online world that are taking over where PKI used to be. One of the biggest of these is, of course, Federation for Identity as opposed to certificate-based identity systems. Next slide, please. Another thing that we can actually talk about, maybe that works now? Yes? No? I don't know if I'm hitting. Oh, wait, I think I'm actually hitting. No, I think I'm just synchronizing with whoever's hitting the button in the background.
Just say next slide.
Okay, I'm just going to say next slide a lot. Go back like 3 slides, please. Yes, right there on her. So one of the things that we know is going to keep happening is we're going to keep going back and forth between thick clients and thin clients because we've done this for a really long time. Back in the mainframe days, we had thin terminals, and we went to PCs, and we went to web applications, and we went to mobile applications. Now we're going back to like mobile web applications and all of this other stuff. This is going to keep swinging back and forth as it has for all time. Next slide, please. One of the things that's really going to be driving this going forward is the fact that APIs are everywhere. They are the plumbing of the internet. I really think that that's going to keep happening. Next slide, because when you have APIs, you also need a way to protect them, and that's where OAuth comes in. OAuth is fundamentally a delegation protocol. It gets used for authorization, but it is all about delegating rights of authority to allow access to an API. It's an open standard that was developed, next slide, back in 2006. Now think about the world in 2006, and it's a very different world than what we have today. If you were like me at all, you were lusting after that particular phone, because that was like the awesome phone of the day, right? But think about this. There was no Android. We had an iPhone, kind of, but there was no app store. Think about a world of smartphones with no app stores, with no app economies and things like that. That didn't exist. You couldn't get on Facebook unless you were a university student. And everybody was actually on MySpace. We actually used that. Strange to think that here in 2016. Next slide, please. One of the biggest things about OAuth 1.0 is that it came up in this world and it actually solved a really real problem. So much so and so well that large internet companies actually deprecated their proprietary protocols in favor of the open standard. Now, what's amazing about this, next slide, is that this doesn't usually happen. What usually happens is that a new standard comes along and it gets put on the shelf next to everything else, and everybody just keeps doing what they've always been doing, and the new standard just kind of sits there along with that. Next slide. So OAuth is a really amazing success story because it is absolutely everywhere. But of course, OAuth 1 wasn't really the end of the story. We developed OAuth2 in 2012 in the standards community to address a lot of the issues that people were having with OAuth 1.0. And this is now absolutely everywhere, all over the web. And I think it's going to stay everywhere for some time now because it really is entrenched. I don't think it's going away. Next slide. But I do think it is going to be changing, even though I wish it wouldn't, because I'm about to publish this book on October 1st. And as soon as the protocol changes, as we know, my book is out of date. And that'll be awesome, right? But the thing is, technology is not going to stop moving, and we're not going to be able to keep it from moving as much as we might want to. Incidentally, if anybody wants a discount code for this book, it's on pre-order right now. Ping me after the talk. Next slide, please. This is a really important question. If OAuth2 is everywhere and it's working pretty well and people are using it, why do I think it's going to change? Well, it already has changed a bit from when it first got published. And to see how that works, let's take a look at building an OAuth application. Next slide. We're going to start with the core specification. It's just one simple RFC, so we're going to read that, and that's really great. But this only tells you how to get a token. Next slide. What we also need is the ability to use a token, right? Okay, so these are all really good. We can get tokens, we can use tokens. Next slide. We also need to choose what options we want inside of all of these protocols. Next slide. And because we are building a security protocol, we want to be able to follow the best security practices in the formal security document for the protocol. Okay, this is great. We got 3 documents, a couple of options that we need to document and figure out what we're going on. This is fine. But of course it doesn't end there, because OAuth doesn't live in a vacuum. It lives in a world, next slide, with all sorts of best practices that you need to roll onto it, and deployment experience that has taught us what we actually need to do, right? How to deploy TLS. OAuth says use TLS, but if you don't use TLS properly, that's not going to get you anywhere. Next slide, please. So, all right, so we're building out our servers. We got all of this. Let's actually build in a client model for our database and all of our clients and stuff like that. Well, it turns out that OAuth doesn't actually define a client model. That gets defined in a later specification, which is actually, that's not its job. Its job was to define dynamic registration, which turns out to be a really useful thing to have anyway. So we're going to add that into our application as well. But if we've got registration, next slide, we also want to be able to manage all of those client registrations. So that if you have a typo in the title, you can actually change that over time. Next slide, please. Now, once we get all of that, we still need tokens. All right, let's pick a formatted token. OAuth doesn't tell us a format of the token, so let's go with JSON Web Tokens. But in order to do JSON Web Tokens, next slide, we need to have the entire Jose suite of specifications under our belts before we can even understand JOTs. Okay, this is not too crazy, but we're getting into crazy territory. Next slide, because we now need to start managing token lifecycles. If I need to be able to throw out tokens, next slide, and if I need to be able to look up a token at runtime to figure out what it's even good for. We've got 2 more specifications for that add more capability on top of OAuth. Next slide, please. And at this point, if you're doing a mobile application, which, you know, today, that's where the pendulum is right now. A lot of people are building out mobile applications that are using OAuth to call backend services. You really want to add Pixie on top of that. But you also need things to know where to go. Next slide, please. So you're going to have some type of discovery layer. Next slide. And you might decide that you need to have more than just the plain OAuth bearer tokens in order to do this. Now, this isn't the end of the game, because, of course, with all of this extra stuff, next slide, there's all sorts of new best practices and security things and all of that other stuff you need to pay attention to. And let's not forget, next slide, you get to build your application on top of all of this. So OAuth is pretty simple. And the thing is, though, there's a lot of stuff that you need to go through to figure out how to do OAuth right. Next slide. So what I think that we're actually going to see out of the community is a best current practices document. A document that you can actually go through and in one place figure out all of the various options and bits and pieces of OAuth that says, no, follow this recipe and do it this way. And this is something that can actually be changed by the community over time, unlike a lot of published standards like RFCs that don't change over time. Next slide, please. For the protocol itself, I think it's likely that in the near future we will see an OAuth 2.1 that takes kind of these best practices and internalizes them. Pixie, for example, for mobile applications, I think that's going to end up being a required component for deployment and stuff like that. We might see an OAuth 3.0, or we might see something entirely different that just completely replaces the OAuth protocol. What that is, I don't know. Otherwise, I'd be going and building it right now. But we might actually see that in the next few years. I don't think it's entirely likely. What we will see, next slide, though, is a lot of changes in debate around the core OAuth protocol itself, such as redefinition and expansion of what the OAuth scope means. Now, in OAuth right now, the scope is really a simple construct that says what this token's good for, but it turns out, in reality, we didn't anticipate this when we wrote OAuth 2, that it people are using it to mean all sorts of different things, including where you want to go and who cares about what you can actually do things. So there's a lot of debate in the community about how we can actually expand that. Next slide, please. I think we're going to see a lot of work around protected discovery systems, especially in communities like this where it's all about personal data and I have sovereignty over where my data lives and stuff like that. You need to be able to discover that in a way that's user-friendly and developer-friendly at the same time. And that's a hard thing to do, especially when you want to preserve privacy. Take, for example, the case if I've got a medical record hiding behind an opaque URL. That's great. I go to that medical record and I try to fetch that, and you say, no, you don't have the right tokens. That's fine. But go over to this authorization server and then come back to me. Well, that all seems well and good until you realize that that authorization server that I just sent you to is the personal authorization server of one particular person, and they are the only person that ever uses it. So I just inadvertently told you whose medical record that was without actually telling you that. Protected discovery is a really hard problem, as it turns out, and there's a lot of debate in the community right now on how to figure this out. Next slide, please. We're seeing a lot of work about how we can get a higher level of security. So proof of possession tokens or POP tokens, I think, are really going to be an interesting thing where you actually get not only the token, but some keying material that you present alongside of it. There is actually an alternative way to do this. Next slide, please. If you want to actually tie this down into the TLS layer using a method called token binding. And this is something that really depends heavily on middleware in the TLS, so it's not something that we're seeing yet. But we may see this going forward in certain applications. The problem with token binding, though, I mean, it's some people get really excited by it, but it's not for everybody. Next slide, please, is that it's really hard to properly do token binding in OAuth because these are all of the connections that you have to deal with in a normal this is a very limited OAuth ecosystem. This is not even talking about all of the advanced protocols and functionalities that get built on it. Next slide, such as OpenID Connect, which is, of course, an identity layer built on top of OAuth. Not only is it an identity layer, but it adds a lot of advanced functionality on top of the core OAuth protocol, and some of this is actually fed back into the community, which has been really cool. Next slide, please. There's the slide. It didn't quite take over the internet like we hoped that it would. It did not replace usernames and passwords. It did, however, replace SAML in most cases. It's really getting footholds in enterprise spaces and kind of large-scale deployments and places like Google. So when you actually sign in with Google, you are using OpenID Connect because Google sees this as a way to commoditize the identity layer so that they can actually do their business and do their value around other things. Next slide, please. One of the biggest challenges, though, to it is getting the incumbents to budge because we talked to Facebook at the beginning of the OpenID Connect process, and they were all on board until the working group made a decision that they didn't agree with, and they just got up and left, and there was nothing we could do because they're Facebook and they're going to do what they want anyway. And they can, because they're big enough that people who want to integrate with Facebook will go there. That's actually also a similar problem with Google. Even though they're running OpenID Connect, they're not running it in its most open and dynamic mode. So you actually have to have a manual registration step if you're going to talk with Google. And so you can't have this dream of everybody being able to connect with their own personal identities and their own servers being able to bring those wherever they want across the internet until people are actually deploying this. This is a really, really big challenge. Next slide, please. Because where I think we really, really need to go is something that scales like email. If you look at the email protocol, I could go and read the specifications and write my own mail server. I could go and download somebody else's mail server and just run that. I actually ran one for years out of my basement for my own personal domain until a zero-day exploit on Christmas Eve, at which point I said, you know what, I'm going to go buy service from a service provider because I'm getting too old for this. And I now do that, and a lot of people I know and a lot of people in this room will actually trade something of theirs, either their advertising eyeballs or something else in order for somebody else to run their mail service for them. This is the Gmail model. The important thing here is that no matter which one of those I choose, no matter which one of those you choose, we can talk to each other. Because that's the nature of the scalability of the email protocol. It's designed to scale to the internet by default. No matter which model I run, no matter which model you run, we can talk. This is where I think a lot of these services really need to go. Next slide, please. OpenID Connect has a whole lot of different extensions. These sometimes get fed back into the wider community, but it also benefits from all of the extensions that we were talking about with OAuth before. So if you're doing OpenID Connect with a mobile application, you can actually use Pixie. You can actually use all of that stuff that we were talking about before. And this, I think, is a really important thing for new protocols coming forward, is to find the base that's already there and build on it properly so that things can actually work together. Next slide, please. We're seeing the rise of these domain-specific profiles of these protocols, like HART and iGov, and there's a FinTech one, and there's a few others. Sorry, that's financial tech, not Finland tech. Sorry to get the Finns excited for that one. But these can do things like mandate higher levels of client authentication and mandate certain levels of interoperable profiles between these things. And these get me really excited because these start to approach the type of email style scalability by default for something that's compliant with these profiles. And I think that there's a really big future with these in specific domains. Next slide. Ultimately, it really boils down to giving people a personal choice of security. I should be able to roll up with my identity and have that work with a system. I should be able to follow the trust on first use pattern. So the first time I'm in a given situation, you prompt me, you ask me, I can consent to that, I can authorize that, and then from that point onward, get out of my way and just let the application do its job, because that is ultimately what users are trying to do. They're trying to do something on the internet. They are not using security systems for the sake of using security systems. They're using security systems because they actually want to go and do something. Next slide, please. Any questions? Thank you. Last slide, please.
Audience also. We have a couple of questions online. I think that that was pretty overwhelming. It's really great overview about what's happening. So,
how much is OAuth influenced by big internet giants? So a fair bit, honestly, because they have sent their representatives to the standards groups. It's not only these internet giants that are in the standards groups. There are a lot of folks like myself who do not represent large internet companies that are going in and making sure that general use cases and other use cases actually are still viable and still work. And but this is actually an ongoing space of tension in the standards communities, because organizations like this, they've got certain issues that they need to solve on a daily basis. So Google, for example, their distributed scaling of their architectures, they make a lot of assumptions about how the world works because that's how Google does things. And sometimes those assumptions get baked into the recommendations that they make into the standards bodies. And I think it's really important that folks that are not in large-scale internet providers can come to the table and say, like, okay, that's a really heavy cost for every tiny little provider to be able to pay in order to actually make this base protocol work.
Just want to continue on that question, that like after being here, for example, being exposed to the presentations and talks earlier in this conference, do you feel that the discussion and the sort of topics raised in the development community and the OAuth standardization bodies, they reflect on what's happening here? Do you think that there is a logical continuum there, or is there some kind of conflict between where is that going and what kind of things people are trying to develop here?
That's a fantastic question, because I don't think it's actually either a conflict or a continuum. I think that there's a lot of orthogonality where there doesn't need to be. I think there's a lot of spaces where communities aren't really paying attention to each other and aren't talking to each other where they really ought to be. I've spoken to a few companies here that are like, we've developed our own authentication standard and it's awesome and it solves all the problems and it's great. And it's like, okay, so how does this work? And break this down. It's like, oh yeah, you reinvented something that we threw out 4 years ago for these following reasons. And so there needs to be more communication between these communities, because a group like this brings very real and very important use cases to the table and very good expertise to the table. But if you stay inside of that insular community where everybody's just like, yes, we will do everything, we're all sitting at the same table and we'll do everything because with the way that we agree at this table, you need to be able to get past that and out into the wider world and get the Googles and Microsofts and folks like that to the table to be able to have those conversations.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's what we are trying to build the bridges here, but it's Doug said this morning that we need to participate, so this is exactly what we need to do, that everybody participate in these standard making bodies. Another question, you raised, I think, that good vision. I've been always thinking about email, even though it is so problematic, it is a very good technology, and we use it still so often. And often it's my core identity or identifier in that sense. So that scale is really, really amazing, and it's a good reflection point. So what do you think? With the current progress and with the current pace of development, when we think that OAuth and OpenID Connect reaches that objective?
That is a fantastic question, because this is something that I think really needs to happen going forward. If you think back in the day, email used to be a heavily, heavily siloed world. So you would get your connection provider, whether it was like Prodigy or AOL or something like that. You could send messages internally, but not across services. There was no cross-service type of thing. There was ARPANET mail, but it was the weird bang addressing, and like nobody liked that. It wasn't until SMTP came along and the large ISPs at the time, we didn't call them ISPs, but the large ISPs at the time, like AOL and Prodigy and the like, actually implemented SMTP, that you could actually do cross-service addressing and stuff like that. OAuth hasn't reached that yet because we're still in a very kind of, I use OAuth to protect my own sort of special snowflake API. We haven't quite reached the world where it's moving past that. I think OpenID Connect has the potential to move past that, but we have really, really big players in the field, Facebook and Google most notably, who don't want to play in a world where anybody can just have their own identity, because they want to have the identities. They want to have that control. And so I think it's going to be a while before we're really in that space. The technology is there. We have discovery systems for individual protocols. We have dynamic registration. We have trust framework lookups and all of this other stuff that we need in order to make it happen. But it's more the business attitude, and in a lot of cases the legal policies surrounding trust, where it really doesn't quite fly yet.
Okay. Thank you, Justin. And now let's move forward. Applause.
Thank you.